Good morning and welcome to Psalm a Day. My name is Evan. I'm one of the ministers at St Mary's Anglican Church. And it's my joy to be with you today as we look at Psalm 94. If you haven't read the psalm yet, let me encourage you to do that, because I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to look at some bits and make some observations from there. So open up Psalm 94. Please read it first. The first thing that we look at is the psalm is pretty neatly divided in two. We have verses 1 to 11 and then verses 12 to 23. And what they are two sides to the same coin. The first, what is that coin? Well, that coin is a God of judgment. A God of judgment. And so the first half, we see one side of the coin, verses 1 to 11. And that's the God according to those whom are being judged or who are facing his judgment. Well, and what constitutes this? Well, if we have a look at verse 2, well, we see that God is asked to rise up and to judge the proud. And verse 3, the wicked. What makes them like this? Well, the psalmist tells us in verse 4, they pour out arrogant words, and they are full of boasting. They crush your people in verse 5. They oppress your inheritance. Verse 6, they slay the widow and the alien. And verse 7, they say that the Lord doesn't see. They say that the Lord is unable to stop them. The Lord is powerless to stop them. And that's quite a common refrain we see throughout the whole Old Testament. Perhaps maybe we still see today that if there is a God, then he can't do anything about it. If there is a God, that he's not powerful enough to stop it. Or maybe a bit more specifically in the Old Testament, your God can't stop me from doing what I'm doing. Your belief can't stop me from doing what I'm doing. And so how does the Lord of all creation, the whole universe sort of will take that? Well, he doesn't quite see eye to eye. Because we see in verses 9 through 11 that the Lord does know. And we see a bit of poetry, a bit of rhetoric from the psalmist. How can the person who implanted the ear not hear? How can the person who formed the eye not see? The Lord has done those things, and he knows, particularly verse 11, the Lord knows the thoughts of man. He knows that they are futile. And so that's the side of the coin which shows us God's judgment, or I guess from the perspective of those who are being judged. If we look at verse 12 and onwards, we get the flip side of the coin. But that is what God's judgment looks like for those who love him, those who follow him, those who are righteous according to him. And so we see it kicks off in verse 12, blessed is the man you discipline, O Lord. And in verse 14, the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance. As well, in verse 16, the psalmist asks for help. He says, who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against the evildoers? The only person who can answer that call is God. Verse 17, unless the Lord had given me help, I would soon have dwelt in the silence of death. When I said, my foot is slipping, your love, O Lord, supported me. When anxiety was great within me, your consolation brought joy to my soul. And so having a coin that is God's judgment, it doesn't have to be negative, because judgment against people who are trying to hurt you means protection, solace, and help for you. Judgment against other people who don't love the Lord, who are not righteous in the Lord's eyes, means love, grace, and freedom for those who do love the Lord, for those who are striving to be righteous in the Lord's eyes. And so we have the two sides of this coin. I feel like some of us would like to get rid of verses 1 to 11 and just say, actually, God doesn't judge. God doesn't judge people who don't love him. God doesn't send people to hell and that sort of stuff. But the truth is, if we don't have one side, if we don't have that side of the coin, you can't have the other side. If you throw away one side of the coin, what you end up doing is throwing away the whole coin. If there's no judgment, then there's no salvation. if everyone gets into heaven, then God is not God, and he is not worthy of following. He is not worthy of our worship. But because he has warned us, because he has told us, and we know about our sin, and even more because he has saved us from our sin through Jesus Christ, we know his love, we know his help, his grace and protection. That's wonderful. Come with me to verse 23, and I'll read it word for word. He will repay them for their sins and destroy them for their wickedness. The Lord our God will destroy them. And here's the tension, the big tension, even though what we just talked about can be quite tense. This is the big one, I think, for us. Because as Christians, we want to love and forgive our enemies as Jesus taught us. But at the same time, we want God's justice and his judgment to prevail over the wicked. And so I want to see the wicked judged, but I also want to see them forgiven. Some people's way around this is love the sinner, hate the sin. But that's not God's attitude. Particularly if we read Romans, if we read this bit here, the sinner and the sin are one package. The sinner chooses to sin. The person disobeying God does that willfully. It's their choice. And so you can't just separate them like you might separate egg white from a yolk and just say, oh, I want this bit, but I don't want that bit. That's not how God's judgment works, because it's a person's choices that merit what happens to them. And so how do we live with this tension? The first thing I think Christians should do is never deny the gospel to anyone. There's no one who is beyond saving. There's no one who is not able, because God is not able to save. There is no one who is so far gone, so unrighteous that they could never be brought to grace. And Paul's story in Acts shows us this. So that's the first thing. Christians are never in a position where they can deny the gospel to someone. The second thing is, we pray for God's judgment to come every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done. We're praying for judgment. That's not a bad thing because we're praying that God is glorified. But just be mindful of what it is we pray, especially if we have friends and family that are not yet Christians. We pray those prayers, but the onus is on us to go and preach the gospel to them. Because if God's kingdom does come, then they will be judged as people from the first side of the coin, verses 1 to 11, when we want them on verses 12 to 23. The third thing is that if we are people who have been wronged, terribly wronged, I'm not just talking about something's happened and you were on the injured party. No, I'm talking about terrible, terrible things. Take solace in the idea that the person, unless they come to Christ, will face judgment for that. They will face judgment for that. And you can pray that justice will be done, whether on Jesus at the cross or on them. And so we live in this tension where it's not love the sinner, hate the sin. It's love everyone, but pray for justice. Give the gospel to everyone, but pray that the wickedness would stop. This is quite a difficult topic. 7 minutes is not enough for me. What am I up to? I'm up to 10. 10 minutes are not enough for me to really flesh out how the Psalms and how I think the gospel teaches us to live with this tension. And so if you have any questions, or if you're wrestling with something from this, or if I've struck maybe the wrong nerve with you, please give me a call, drop me a line, so that we can we can chat about it a little bit more. Grace and peace to you.